On June 13, 1944, just 1 week after D-Day, a new sound appeared in the night sky over southern England. It was a harsh, mechanical buzzing, like a giant motorbike engine flying overhead, that sent people running for shelter. Then the sound stopped. In the sudden silence that followed, Londoners counted seconds, waiting for the inevitable explosion. When it came, buildings collapsed, fires erupted, and the city's fragile hope that the worst was over shattered along with the windows. The weapon was the V1, Vergeltungswaffe 1, or Vengeance Weapon 1. It was Hitler's response to D-Day. A pilotless aircraft packed with 1,870 pounds of high explosive, launched from sites in occupied France and aimed at London. The British called them buzz bombs or doodle bugs because of their distinctive engine sound. But there was nothing comical about them. They were the world's first cruise missiles, and they were killing hundreds of Londoners every week. The V1 campaign represented a new kind of warfare. Automated terror that required no pilots to risk their lives, no bombers to penetrate defenses, just machines flying themselves to their targets. It was warfare stripped of humanity, reduced to engineering and trajectory calculations. And for the first weeks of the campaign, Britain had no effective defense against it. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them reliably. Barrage balloons were useless against weapons flying at 400 miles per hour. Fighter pilots who tried to intercept them discovered that most British aircraft couldn't catch the flying bombs, and those that could face the terrifying prospect of shooting at a bomb that might explode in their face. But some pilots found ways. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Ken Collier and the other Tempest pilots of 3 and 486 squadrons. Men who turned the desperate defense of London into the first battle against unmanned aerial vehicles. They developed techniques that seemed suicidal, flying alongside flying bombs and tipping them with their wingtips, sending the V-1s tumbling into open country where they exploded harmlessly. They pushed their aircraft to limits the designers hadn't anticipated. And they did it day after day, mission after mission, until the V1 threat was finally contained. This is their story. The forgotten battle against Hitler's robot bombs, fought by pilots who invented tactics as they went, who risked instant death with every interception, and who ultimately saved London from devastation that could have crippled Britain's war effort in the final year of the war. The weapon from the future. The V1 was a remarkably simple weapon, which made it both cheap to produce and difficult to stop. It consisted of a sheet metal fuselage with stubby wings, powered by a pulse jet engine mounted above the tail. The pulse jet was essentially a hollow tube with shutters at the front. Air rushed in, mixed with fuel, ignited, and the shutters slammed shut as the explosion pushed the aircraft forward. Then the shutters opened again, and the cycle repeated, roughly 50 times per second. This created the distinctive buzzing sound that gave the weapon its nickname. The entire V1 was designed for one-way flight. No landing gear, no pilot, no reusable components. A gyroscopic autopilot kept it flying straight and level A, simple mechanical counter, driven by a propeller on the nose, measured distance traveled. When the counter reached a preset number, calculated to correspond with the distance to London, it triggered a mechanism that put the V1 into a dive and armed the warhead. The bomb fell on whatever was beneath it when the counter ran out. This simplicity made the V1 terrifyingly effective as a terror weapon. It wasn't accurate enough for military targets. The guidance system could only put the bomb somewhere in Greater London, not on specific buildings, but that was sufficient for its purpose. The goal wasn't to destroy British military capability, but to break civilian morale, to convince Londoners that the war was hopeless, to force the British government to divert resources from the offensive campaign in France to defend the homeland. The first V-1s began falling on London on June 13, 1944. Within 3 days, 73 flying bombs had hit the city, killing over 400 people and injuring thousands more. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which had clear beginnings and endings, the V-1 campaign was continuous. The bombs came at all hours, without warning, without pattern. The distinctive engine sound became a trigger for panic. As long as you could hear the buzz, the bomb was still flying past. When the sound stopped, you had perhaps 15 seconds before impact. The British government, still celebrating the success of D-Day, suddenly faced a crisis that threatened to undermine everything the invasion had achieved. If the V-1 campaign continued unchecked, London could become uninhabitable. Civilian casualties would mount, war production would be disrupted, and the government might be forced to evacuate the capital. A propaganda victory for Germany that could boost morale at a critical moment when Allied forces were advancing through France. The immediate response was improvised and largely ineffective. Anti-aircraft batteries tried to shoot down the V-1s, but struggled to track targets moving at 400 miles per hour and flying as low as 2,000 feet. Barrage balloons were raised to 5,000 feet, hoping the V-1s would hit the cables. But most bombs flew below the balloon line. Fighter pilots attempted interceptions, but discovered that most RAF aircraft were too slow to catch a V-1 in level flight. The Spitfire Mark V, which had been the backbone of fighter command for years, could barely reach 350 miles per hour. Not nearly fast enough. The few aircraft that could match the V-1's speed faced a different problem. How do you safely shoot down a flying bomb? Standard fighter tactics called for closing to short range and firing bursts into the enemy aircraft. But getting close to a V-1 meant risking catastrophic explosion if your bullets hit the warhead. Several pilots who successfully intercepted V-1s were killed when the flying bombs exploded, either from their own gunfire or because the bombs had reached their preset range and dove just as the fighter was closing in. Britain needed faster aircraft and new tactics. They got both, though not quickly enough to prevent thousands of deaths. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. The Tempest arrives. The Hawker Tempest was Britain's fastest operational piston engine fighter in 1944. Capable of over 430 miles per hour at low altitude, fast enough to catch a V-1 in level flight. It was a relatively new design, having only entered service in early 1944, and production numbers were limited. Most Tempests were assigned to ground attack missions supporting the invasion of France. But when the V-1 campaign began, several Tempest squadrons were hastily reassigned to air defense duties. The Tempest was a beast of an aircraft. Massive by fighter standards, powered by a 2,180 horsepower Napier Sabre engine that made it fast but demanded constant attention. The Sabre was a complex H-24 configuration engine, essentially two flat 12 engines stacked and geared together, that produced tremendous power but was temperamental and prone to overheating. Pilots had to monitor coolant temperatures constantly, particularly during the high-speed chases required to intercept V-1s. But the Tempest had advantages beyond raw speed. Its four 20mm Hispano cannons provided heavy firepower. The thick wing could absorb battle damage, The aircraft was stable at high speeds, making it an excellent gun platform. And the bubble canopy provided excellent visibility, critical for spotting the small, fast-moving V-1s against the cluttered background of the English countryside. Among the pilots assigned to V-1 interception duties was Flight Lieutenant Ken Collier of 3 Squadron. Collier was an experienced pilot who'd flown Hurricanes earlier in the war. But the Tempest was something else entirely. Faster, more powerful, more demanding than anything he'd flown before. Learning to fly it while simultaneously developing tactics to intercept flying bombs required adapting on the fly, literally. The early interception attempts followed standard fighter tactics: spot the V-1, close in behind it, fire a burst into the fuselage or engine, break away before it exploded. This worked, but it was dangerous. The V-1 flew in a straight line at constant altitude, making it an easy target once you caught it. But that same predictability meant the bomb was essentially a flying target packed with explosives. If your timing was off, if you closed too near before firing, if the bomb exploded as you were pulling away, you died. Several pilots were killed or badly injured in the first weeks of the campaign. Squadron leader Joseph Berry, one of the leading V-1 killers, was blown out of the sky when a bomb exploded just as he fired. He survived with severe injuries, but never flew again. Others weren't so fortunate. The wreckage of Tempests and Spitfires, scattered across Kent and Sussex alongside the V-1s they destroyed, testified to the dangers of this new kind of combat. Pilots began looking for alternatives to gunfire. Some tried closing in and disrupting the airflow over the V-1's wings, hoping to make it crash without explosions. This occasionally worked, but was unpredictable. Others tried positioning themselves ahead of the V-1 and firing backward, though this required exceptional gunnery and positioned the fighter directly in the bomb's path if the pilot miscalculated. Then someone, accounts differ on exactly who first attempted it, discovered that you could fly alongside a V-1, position your wingtip under its wing, and then gently lift. The V-1's gyroscopic autopilot couldn't compensate for the sudden change in flight characteristics. The bomb would roll, tumble out of control, and crash before reaching its target. And the fighter pilot, if he judged the maneuver correctly, would be safely clear when it exploded. The art of tipping. Wing tipping a V-1 required skill and nerve that seemed superhuman. The maneuver worked because the V-1's autopilot was designed to keep the wings level using a gyroscope. When a pilot positioned his wingtip under the V-1's wing and applied slight upward pressure, he upset the gyro's reference. The autopilot, sensing the wings were no longer level, attempted to correct. But the correction was based on false information from the now tumbled gyro. The V-1 would roll violently, its simple control system unable to regain stability, and it would spiral into the ground. But executing the maneuver required getting within inches of a flying bomb traveling at 400 miles per hour. The pilot had to match the V-1's speed exactly, position his aircraft with extraordinary precision, and then maintain that position long enough to upset the gyro. If he positioned too far away, nothing happened. If he got too close, his wingtip could strike the V-1, potentially destroying both aircraft. The closure had to be gentle. Too much force and the V-1 might explode or collide with the fighter. Ken Collier became one of the masters of this technique. He described it as like sliding alongside a car on the motorway and then gently nudging it toward the shoulder. Except the car was packed with explosives, traveling at 6 miles per minute, and any mistake meant instant death. The concentration required was immense. The V-1 would be visible through the canopy, close enough to see rivets in its sheet metal skin. The pilot's wingtip would be perhaps 6 inches from the bomb's wing. Any turbulence, any slight miscalculation, any moment of inattention could prove fatal. The timing mattered too. Pilots couldn't tip V-1s anywhere. They had to ensure the bomb would crash in open country rather than in populated areas, and this meant identifying safe crash zones while flying at maximum speed, calculating trajectory and distance, and executing the tip at precisely the right moment. Some V-1s were tipped multiple times by different pilots, each one nudging it further from London until it finally crashed in a field or woods. Not all pilots could master the technique. It required exceptional flying skill, perfect depth perception, and nerves that allowed you to fly within touching distance of a ton of explosives without freezing. Many pilots preferred gunfire despite the risks. At least shooting gave you some distance from the explosion. But the pilots who mastered tipping found it strangely satisfying. There was an artistry to it, a precision that felt more like sport than combat. The technique also saved ammunition. Tempests carried enough 20mm ammunition for about 12 seconds of continuous firing, enough to destroy 3 or 4 V-1s if every burst was effective. But cannon ammunition was relatively scarce, and expending it on flying bombs meant having less available if German fighters appeared. Tipping required no ammunition, just skill and courage. A pilot who mastered it could destroy dozens of V-1s in a single sortie, limited only by fuel and the number of bombs he could intercept. By late summer 1944, the Tempest squadrons had developed the V-1 interception into a science. They established patrol zones off the coast, positioned to intercept bombs as they crossed from France. Ground controllers vectored fighters toward incoming V-1s using radar. Pilots learned to spot the distinctive pulse jet exhaust, a bright orange flame visible for miles. They developed standard procedures. Spot the V-1, close from behind and slightly below to avoid the exhaust flame, match speed, position wingtip, execute the tip, break away, and watch for the crash. The statistics were impressive. Between June and September 1944, RAF fighters destroyed over 1,900 V-1s, roughly a quarter of all bombs launched toward England. The Tempest squadrons accounted for a disproportionate share of these kills. Individual pilots racked up scores that would have been remarkable in conventional air combat. Squadron leader Joseph Barry, despite his injuries, was credited with 61.5 V-1 kills before being wounded. Flight officer Jean Marador of 3 Squadron destroyed 18 in a single day. Ken Collier's score eventually exceeded 30, most accomplished through wingtipping. The cost of defense. The V-1 campaign killed over 6,000 civilians and seriously injured nearly 18,000 more before it ended in late 1944. These numbers were lower than they would have been without the fighter defense, but they were still catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The psychological toll was immense. The constant threat, the inability to predict when or where the next bomb would fall, the knowledge that death could arrive without warning at any moment. The pilots flying interception missions experienced their own psychological strain. They were fighting an enemy that couldn't surrender, couldn't be frightened off, couldn't be negotiated with. Every V-1 was a suicide weapon by design, flying toward its target with mechanical persistence. Destroying one meant nothing. Another would be launched. The campaign was one of attrition. where success was measured not in decisive victories, but in the slow accumulation of intercepted bombs. The flying itself was exhausting. Pilots often flew multiple sorties per day, spending hours at high speed and low altitude, constantly scanning for targets. The Tempest's powerful engine generated tremendous noise and vibration. The high-speed pursuit of V-1s subjected pilots to sustained high-G maneuvers. The concentration required to execute wingtips safely couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Fatigue accumulated, and fatigued pilots made mistakes. Several pilots were killed not by V-1 explosions, but by accidents. Misjudged recoveries from dives, mid-air collisions with other fighters pursuing the same target. Mechanical failures exacerbated by the constant high-speed operations. The Tempest's Sabre engine, pushed to its limits day after day, suffered frequent failures. Coolant leaks, bearing failures, and complete engine seizures forced emergency landings. Some pilots survived multiple engine failures. Others didn't. The ground crews worked around the clock, keeping the Tempests operational. Each aircraft required hours of maintenance after every mission, checking the engine, inspecting the airframe for stress cracks, reloading ammunition, refueling. The pace was relentless. Mechanics slept beside their aircraft, waking when fighters returned to begin immediate servicing. Quality suffered inevitably. There wasn't time for thorough inspections, so problems were sometimes missed until they caused in-flight failures. The casualties among ground crew were lower than among pilots, but they existed. V-1s that evaded interception sometimes crashed near airfields. One hit the officer's mess at a Tempest base, killing several pilots between missions. Another destroyed a fuel dump, creating an inferno that burned for days. The defense of London wasn't just aerial combat. It was an entire system of people working under constant threat. The campaign winds down. By September 1944, the Allied advance through France had overrun most V-1 launch sites. The Germans attempted to continue the campaign by launching V-1s from modified He-11 bombers flying over the North Sea. But these air-launched attacks were less effective and more easily intercepted. The V-2 rocket, which began falling on London in September, was far more deadly but also far more expensive and produced in smaller numbers. The peak of the V-1 threat had passed. The final statistics showed the effectiveness of Britain's multi-layered defense. Of the roughly 10,000 V-1s launched toward England, about 7,500 crossed the coast. Of those, anti-aircraft guns destroyed about 2,000, barrage balloons caught about 300, and fighters destroyed about 1,900. The remaining 3,300 reached their targets. Mostly London, but also other cities and military installations. The defense wasn't perfect, but it had prevented catastrophe. Without the fighter interceptions, thousands more would have died. For the Tempest pilots, the end of the V-1 campaign meant reassignment to ground attack duties supporting the advance into Germany. Some welcomed the change. Conventional combat missions against human opponents who could be frightened or outmaneuvered. Others found it anticlimactic after the intensity of V-1 interception. There was something pure about fighting flying bombs. No moral ambiguity, no question about whether the target deserved destruction. Every V-1 intercepted was a V-1 that didn't kill civilians. The math was simple and satisfying in ways that combat rarely was. Ken Collier survived the war and returned to civilian life, rarely speaking about his service. Like many pilots, he found that the things that seemed normal during wartime flying within inches of flying bombs, risking death multiple times per day, watching friends die in fiery crashes, became difficult to explain to people who hadn't experienced them. The wingtipping that had seemed routine in 1944 sounded insane when described to civilians in peacetime. So mostly he didn't describe it. He'd done his job, survived, and moved on. Legacy of the First Drone War. The V-1 campaign was the first time in history that unmanned aerial vehicles were used extensively in warfare. The flying bombs were crude by modern standards, unguided beyond their simple distance measuring system, vulnerable to interception, inaccurate. But they demonstrated principles that would define future warfare. They showed that automated weapons could terrorize populations without risking pilots. They proved that defenses against such weapons required specialized aircraft and tactics. They revealed that the psychological impact of unpiloted attacks could equal or exceed their physical damage. The tactics developed by Collier and the other Tempest pilots, high-speed interception, close-range engagement, the willingness to position yourself inches from an explosive device traveling at 400 miles per hour, presaged challenges that modern air forces face against cruise missiles and drones. The technical details have changed, but the fundamental problem remains. How do you intercept a small, fast-moving target that carries its own destruction and has no regard for its own survival? Modern air defenses use missiles and electronic warfare rather than fighters with cannons. But the mission is the same. Detect the incoming weapon, intercept it before it reaches its target, destroy it without being destroyed yourself. The V-1 campaign taught lessons about integrated air defense, about the need for early warning systems, about the value of multiple defensive layers. These lessons informed Cold War air defense planning and remain relevant today, when drones and cruise missiles are commonplace weapons. The Tempest itself became obsolete quickly after the war, rendered unnecessary by jet fighters that were faster and more capable. But during the summer of 1944, it was exactly the right aircraft at the right time. Fast enough to catch V-1s, rugged enough to survive the intense operations, and flown by pilots skilled enough to develop techniques nobody had imagined would be necessary. The Forgotten Battle. The V-1 interception campaign is largely forgotten today, overshadowed by more famous air battles like the Battle of Britain or the bomber offensive against Germany. There are no major monuments to the pilots who defended London against flying bombs, no popular films dramatizing their exploits, no household names among the V-1 killers. The battle doesn't fit neatly into conventional narratives of World War II. It was defensive rather than offensive, fought against machines rather than human opponents, waged in skies that were supposedly already won. But the campaign mattered immensely to the people who lived through it. For Londoners who'd endured years of conventional bombing, the V-1s represented a new level of threat. Impersonal, random, unstoppable by shelter or luck. The knowledge that pilots were intercepting many of the bombs provided psychological relief that was as important as the physical protection. The distinctive sound of a Tempest at full throttle, heard overhead as a V-1 approached, meant someone was trying to save you. Often they succeeded. Ken Collier and the other Tempest pilots didn't see themselves as heroes. They'd been given a job, stop the flying bombs, and they'd developed methods to do it. That some of those methods involved flying closer to explosive devices than any sane person would consider safe was simply what the mission required. They'd calculated the risks, decided the math favored attempting interception over letting the bombs through, and acted accordingly. This pragmatic approach to extraordinary danger characterized the entire V-1 defense. There was no time for grand strategy or careful planning. The bombs were falling, people were dying, and something had to be done immediately. So pilots flew missions that pushed their aircraft and themselves to the limits. Ground crews worked impossible hours, and an entire defense system was improvised under pressure. It worked because it had to work. Failure meant continued civilian casualties that Britain couldn't afford. The cost of innovation. The V-1 campaign demonstrated both the promise and limitations of automated weapons. Hitler had hoped the flying bombs would break British morale and force a negotiated peace. Instead, they strengthened British resolve, while confirming that Germany was losing. Only a nation running out of options would resort to terror weapons against civilians. The V-1s killed thousands, but accomplished nothing strategically. They diverted German resources from more effective weapons. They gave the Allies experience defending against automated attacks that would prove valuable in future conflicts. For the pilots who fought them, the V-1s represented a glimpse of future warfare that was both fascinating and disturbing. Combat against human opponents involved psychology, skill, and chance. Combat against machines involved only skill and persistence. The V-1s felt no fear, made no mistakes, never gave up. Some pilots found this purity appealing. Others found it depressing. You couldn't frighten off a V-1 or make it surrender. You could only destroy it or let it through. The wing-tipping technique, which seemed so audacious, was actually the logical endpoint of a simple calculation. What's the minimum risk method of destroying a flying bomb? Gunfire risked detonation at close range. Long-range gunfire wasted ammunition. Tipping, executed correctly, eliminated both risks. It required bringing yourself within inches of explosion, but only for seconds. And the reward was certain destruction of the target without ammunition expenditure. The math favored tipping, so pilots who could master it did so. This cold calculation of risk versus reward, this willingness to do whatever the mission required regardless of how insane it appeared, characterized the entire V-1 defense. Nobody wanted to fly alongside flying bombs. Nobody thought it was safe or smart. But it was effective. And effectiveness mattered more than safety when thousands of lives hung in the balance. The summer London almost fell. The summer of 1944 could have been catastrophic for London. If the V-1 campaign had begun 6 months earlier, before D-Day, the impact would have been far worse if the flying bombs had been more accurate, or carried larger warheads, or been launched in greater numbers. They might have made the city uninhabitable. If Britain hadn't had the Tempest, or if pilots hadn't developed interception techniques quickly enough, the casualties would have been significantly higher. But the campaign was blunted through a combination of technology, tactics, and raw courage. The Tempest provided the speed needed to catch V-1s. The pilots provided the skill to destroy them. The ground controllers provided the coordination to vector fighters toward targets. The anti-aircraft batteries and barrage balloons provided additional defensive layers. The entire system, though improvised and imperfect, was sufficient to reduce the V-1 from a war-winning weapon to a tragic but survivable threat. Ken Collier and the pilots of 3 Squadron, 486 Squadron, and the other units assigned to V-1 interception didn't save London alone. But they were essential components of the defense. And without them, thousands more would have died as they flew missions that seemed impossible, developed techniques that appeared suicidal, and kept flying day after day through a summer when the future of London hung in uncertain balance. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote to World War II, but as the first chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle with automated warfare. The V-1 was crude, but it demonstrated principles that define modern conflict. The use of unmanned systems, the challenge of defending against weapons that can't be deterred, the need for rapid tactical innovation when facing new threats. The pilots who fought the first drone war did so with aircraft that were already becoming obsolete, using tactics they invented under pressure. Risking their lives to protect a city that was home to millions of people who never knew their names. That anonymity is perhaps fitting. The battle against the V-1s wasn't about individual glory. It was about the collective effort to stop weapons that threatened to make London unlivable. Every intercepted bomb was a victory, but every victory was shared among the pilot who made the interception, the ground controller who vectored him to the target, the mechanics who kept his aircraft flying, and the intelligence officers who identified launch sites. No single person could take credit, and no single person tried. Ken Collier returned to peacetime obscurity, his extraordinary summer of 1944 becoming a memory he rarely discussed. The Tempest was retired and scrapped, its brief moment of critical importance ending with the war. The V-1 launch sites in France were overrun and destroyed, though a few remain as historical sites today. London rebuilt, the scars of the flying bomb campaign gradually fading as new construction replaced destroyed buildings. But the lessons endured. In air defense doctrine, in tactics for intercepting cruise missiles, in the understanding that automated weapons require specialized responses the summer of 1944. When pilots flew alongside flying bombs and tipped them with their wings, became a case study in innovation under pressure, in the human response to inhuman warfare, in the courage required to fly within inches of death because people below were counting on you. That's the legacy of Ken Collier and the V-1 interceptors. Not monuments or fame, but the saved lives of people who never knew they were in danger. Prevented by pilots who made the impossible look routine through repetition and skill. They were the first to fight the drone war. They won, not decisively, but sufficiently. And in winning, they wrote the first chapter of a story that continues today. Every time a pilot or missile defense system faces an incoming automated threat and has seconds to respond. The battle that saved London wasn't the most famous of World War II. But for the thousands who would have died without it, and for the future of warfare that it presaged, it deserves to be remembered as one of the most important. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.